Hello, welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Megha Bhatia and I work with Informa as training producer. Thank you for joining us for Purchasing and Procurement, What's the Difference? As you know, this webinar will be led by our very popular course director, Ian Moody. But before we start, I'd like to take you through a few housekeeping rules. Thank you. Okay, so just to give you an idea, the slides will be recorded, the recording of the webinar and the slides will be emailed to you through a link after the webinar takes place. There will be an automatic post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screens. Please take the time to complete that for us. With regards to questions, you can type your questions throughout the session and we will allocate time at the end of the session for the speaker to address your questions. I'd just like to introduce your speaker this evening. Ian Moody, well, what can I say about him? He is one of our very, very popular course directors, runs several procurement and supply chain related courses for us. He is also the lead tutor with CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. You've probably already read his bio by now. I'm going to pass this on to Ian now. Over to you. Enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Megha. Hi, everybody. I hope we're all well. Hi, Megha. I hope we're all well. We are there. Sorry, I seem to have a slight technical problem with microphones. Always the same. Right. I hope everybody's well. Good to be here. Let's have a little talk about this whole issue related to supply chain itself for a few moments. There's been major changes in the way that we consider the role of supply chain, procurement, purchasing, buying, all these various terminologies over the last few years. One of the biggest issues has been the professionalization of supply chain and procurement activity. For a long time, it was seen to be simply a support function within businesses, often reporting into the finance department. Over the recent years, there have been more and more corporate problems related to supply chain and procurement activity, both within large organizations and also within the public sector. So we start to think about how we should consider the actual roles of supply chain, purchasing, procurement, buying. What do we actually do? What are the differences between these terms? You know, I often find in many organizations they start calling procurement purely because that's what everybody seems to say, not because they necessarily understand what procurement does, not because they know it's different from purchasing activity, but it's just because it's become fashionable. So let's think about it in simple terms. Here we've got a simple slide showing an organization as an open system. It's not difficult, it's relatively easy. Organizations, all organizations, doesn't matter what you do, go through the same processes. You put things in, you do something to them, and you put them out. Input. Inputs. Where does input come from? Well, it comes from the people that work in the organization. It comes from the labor force. It comes through financial resources are put into the information. It comes from information resources that come into the information. It comes through raw materials, componentry, consumables, equipment, many different factors. When you look at that, you suddenly realize that the majority of these are being bought, to use a terminology. They're being bought in. They're being attained, acquired. In fact, what is happening is they're being purchased. So inputs. Then you look at processes. What goes on in processes? We design things, we manufacture things, we assemble them, we sell them. We use treatments such as staff development, culture, etc., to help us to put those out to the market. And what goes out to the market? The products, the services, the information, the profits. When we do that, we have an environmental impact. So you look at supply chain. Supply chain is the input and the output. That's exactly what supply chain is. Supply chain deals with the inputs and the outputs. If you get the inputs right, you'll get the outputs right. If you get the inputs wrong, you'll get the outputs wrong. If you have no input, you'll simply have no output. So in simple terms, we need to start to understand the importance of getting it right. So people try to define supply chain. If you look, you're quite obviously able to look as much as anybody else is, and you will find there's 101 different definitions of supply chain. But in simple terms, it's the process by which we bring goods, materials and services into businesses, put them through transformation and send them out to the customer. It's that simple. The problem comes in supply chains is when we start to look at the length of supply chains. The problem today is that we work in a very globalized marketplace. And even if we're not buying on a globalized basis, we are working with a global supply chain because our suppliers will be buying on a global basis. Whatever happens in their supply chains will impact upon our supply chains. It has a major knock-on effect. One of the classic explanations of that, extremely well-known one, is something that happened only last year, which everybody thought was quite amusing, but in its own way was actually very serious. And that was the story of the horse meat fiasco in the meat lasagne. Findus Foods. Findus Foods, a very old, long-established company, more than 130 years old. Famous for various things, but basically frozen foods. One of their biggest products happens to be fish fingers. But the lasagne, in a normal way, of course, we would have people going around checking food standards, so that's exactly what happened. British government, in this case, went into a supermarket and checked the standard of the product on the shelf for public hygiene and safety reasons. When they checked the so-called beef lasagne, it was discovered that it wasn't beef at all. It had large proportions of horse meat. Well, they then went to Findus and they said, explain what's happening. You manufactured this product. They said, well, we didn't actually. We didn't manufacture it. We bought it in from one of our suppliers in France. Oh, well, you sold it. You're responsible. Well, our supplier's responsible. We can't know what our supplier's doing. Yes, you can. You're responsible. Oh, we go to the supplier and we ask the supplier. And the supplier said, well, actually, we received processed beef from another factory somewhere in France. Well, we go there and we'll look there. Well, we received actual meat from a company somewhere in Hungary. We go there and we look there. Well, we received our meat from a slaughterhouse somewhere in Romania, and so on, and so on, and so on. Okay. Well, that actually had the knock-on effect of, was Findus Food created such a problem that when the government started to look in greater detail, they discovered that many products actually were not what they were meant to be. This then became a pan-European problem. Ended up with questions being asked in the European Parliament. It cost Findus Foods in France alone in 1 week 1 million euros. That wasn't cost of putting it right, that was the profit. The company lost in the first week 1 million euros because of a lack of understanding of their supply chain. Too many people misunderstand. They think it's all about let's buy the cheapest we can. If you do that, you will give yourself nothing but a problem. It doesn't work on price. We have the Findus Food fiasco. Imagine if my various friends and colleagues who are Muslim had had that product tested and it had been discovered that there were traces of pig as opposed to traces of horse meat. What kind of problem would that have caused? Now, we go deeper. One other issue about supply chains was the problem in Bangladesh. When the factory collapsed in Bangladesh, 1,100 people died. 1,100 people died. The current death toll because of injuries in hospital later are 3,500. 3,500 people died. Why? Because of poor supply chain management on behalf of Primark. Primark knew what they did wrong. They've tried to fix it by giving compensation to the survivors of that factory. It is a supply chain problem. If anybody wants to know a little bit more about that, maybe that's going to come out in questions later. But these are very serious issues. So we can talk about things like Findus Food. We can talk about human life because of people not understanding the nature of their supply chains and how they work. So this is serious stuff, and that is why we have to start to understand professionalism within our supply chains. When you look at it, this is what happens. Things come from up and downstream. Upstream simply means what it says, further up than you. And the problem is, how far upstream do we go? Literally, maybe we need to know exactly where the product is coming from when it's mined out of the ground, or what the farmer's doing before we sell the bread in the shop, because the bread is used to make flour. The wheat is made to use flour, the flour is made to use bread, the bread goes into the shop, and then it's then sold on to the public. What exactly is happening? We need to start to understand the principal flows of supply chains, and we need to understand that, in fact, whilst that shows it as a flow diagram, in reality it's not. It's a series of networked nodes. Every time an organization buys, it doesn't just buy from upstream of itself, it buys from downstream of itself. Downstream, you buy insurance from an insurance company. That's downstream. So it doesn't matter where you are, you're going to be buying from different companies who have got different sections all over the world, all over different markets, different functions, and it becomes extremely complicated. These things put businesses at risk. Not only do they put businesses at risk, they can destroy companies. And as I've just explained, when they get them very wrong, they can destroy human life. It's a very serious issue, this. Supply chain and its associated disciplines, of which procurement and purchasing are some, must not be treated as some form of second-class function. It is strategic to the future survival of business. Business is future to the survival of nations, and nations' economies are part of what is the global economy. We're all interlinked, and that's never been more than it is today with global supply chains. In this region, we are used to the fact that we work in global supply chains because we have to. We have very little option than to work with suppliers from outside of the region because we don't yet have the high level of SMEs working here. So we have to go out. Failure to understand the nature of our supply chains is business suicide. That's what it is. And it's not just your business, it's the whole economy. In recent years, there's been a big change. This particular slide comes from a book written by Cole, Bardi and Langley. It was actually written in 2002. The 2002 date isn't a cut-off date, it just relates to the book. And they were looking back from 2002 and seeing what's been happening over the two generation periods before. A business generation is basically considered to be 20 years. So if we move back 20 years from 2002 to 1982, that it started to be an integration of supply chain activity. If you go back to 1962, supply chain activity was considered as a series of separate actions. So what is supply chain? What is in it? Well, demand forecasting, purchasing, requirements planning, production, manufacturing inventory, warehousing, materials handling, industrial packaging, finished goods inventory, distribution planning, order processes, transportation, customer services. All these are functions of supply chain. Basically, this is business. That's what it is. It's running a business. What every business does in one way or another. Doesn't matter who you are, you do those things. It's just how much of those you do. And by 1992, we'd actually started to consider them and bring them together under two key areas. One is known as materials management. Materials management led to certain managerial supply chain techniques, such as MRP and MRP2. Then we have the idea of physical distribution itself. So they started to bring the disciplines under one. So we got one basic banner. And today that's been brought together under one single banner, which is known as logistics. Now, in this case, the word logistics does not mean transport and distribution. That terminology has been borrowed by transport and distribution companies. And they've started to call themselves logistic companies, much in the way that some organizations are calling purchasing procurement. Without understanding, it's not the same thing. What logistics means, it comes from the word of logic. A series of logical processes that come together to create an integrated function. That's what it means. So logistics involves all of these elements. All of them: demand forecasting, purchasing, requirements planning, production planning, etc. All of these are logistics. They're all part of what is logistics. Logistics companies, as I say, have simply borrowed the term. They're doing one area of this or two areas of this, normally only one or two. Yeah, that is to say, they're doing things like transportation services, warehousing services. Some very advanced companies, they might be doing production planning as well within logistics areas. But fundamentally, it's about warehousing, materials handling, transportation. All right, but logistics doesn't actually mean that in the case of this slide. This is the management of logistics processes. That is to say, the management of business. So supply chain is about the management of business. It's about how do I gain a competitive advantage by making myself better at any part of my business function through input to transformation, sometimes known as operations, to output. What do I do? So, over recent years, there's been some major changes in the way of thinking. Services have become so much more important. Organizations are beginning to realize that services are key. It's not about how quickly or cheaply I can make a product. It's how much service I can add to my customer in that process. It's about designing and producing a quality that matters, not about how cheap I can do it, not about what the price is. It's about what the value is. And the word value doesn't mean price. The word value means the difference or the relationship between price and performance. So what is it giving me? How does it perform? What is it that you have that nobody else has? And if you think about it, only this morning we had the results out for certain key companies. This morning whilst I was eating my breakfast, I was listening to Bloomberg. And I noticed that Apple's results were released for the quarter year. Apple have just posted the largest single corporate profit for a quarter year of any organization anywhere ever in the world. And that includes all of the oil and gas companies. Apple are not cheap manufacturers of electrical and computer goods. They're at the top, but they have created a reputation for service, and it's service more than anything that have created Apple's place in the marketplace. 3 weeks ago, my son bought a new iMac. It's had a very small problem with one of the keys. He took it back to the local Apple store. They said, we won't fix it, we'll send it to the factory to find out what's going on. Here is a new one. He said he was shocked because actually it was a very small problem. It was a sticky key, and that's all it was. But that's what they did. Service, 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 service. And they've recognized it. And people will pay for it. We are sick, most of us anyway, are sick of being treated like idiots. We have the right to good products. We have the right to good services. And we have to receive them. Another area of supply chain activity is to realize that information can replace the need for inventory. When we put things into inventory, we increase our costs by an average of 30%. If you buy something for $100, you put it in inventory, it's cost you $130. I recently did an exercise during a finance course that I was running with a particular company here in the Gulf who didn't believe that number. So we calculated it. It was actually 49%. Poor guy nearly had a heart attack, especially as he was the inventory manager. Information can replace inventory. All right. Have you heard of SAP? You heard of Oracle? That's what they're for. That's exactly what they're for. Services are increasingly outsourced. This is an absolute reality of life. Outsourcing contracts are a major element of business focus today because there are certain functions that we cannot develop up-to-date contemporary thinking fast enough to be able to guarantee that we can get it inside. When you put the service contracts inside, what happens is they become cost conscious, not service conscious. So if you look at changes in outsourcing of service contracts, for years companies have used auditors to outsource, mainly because that is a legal requirement. However, then we started to think about outsourcing in more detail. Transport, distribution, warehousing. The whole of the retail industry woke up and realized we could not afford to do it ourselves. It's not what we're there for. If we're retailers, we're there to select products and put them into shops to sell to people, not there to build warehouses. So they've outsourced. You look there today, most of the major retailers of the world, by which I mean the big boys, I'm talking about the Walmarts, the Carrefours, the Aldi's, the Tesco's of this world, the big retailers, they outsource. It has their name on the side of the truck. It has their name on the warehouse, but it's not theirs. They've outsourced. It's too expensive. It's too costly in capital, and it's too costly in resources. Then we look at other areas of outsourcing. Inevitably, things like training get outsourced because people can't keep enough trainers with enough skill internally to make it economically, so they outsource it. Right? The biggest single growth area in outsourcing at this very moment in time is in procurement. The big boys, that by which I mean the big consultancy, the big four, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, all have major outsourcing companies within procurement. And they're working for governments, they're working for large organizations. This is big business, seriously big business, because of the risk I've just explained within actually the supply chain itself. People have understood they need to get these skills. I currently, amongst many of my other things, work with a major university in London. I have over 250 students who work within the outsourced division of KPMG. And they're my students studying for professional qualifications in supply chain and procurement. They have to have it. It's not an if, it's not a but. They have to have it. And then trying to find ways of combining automation with outsourcing to enable networks to work, to use porthole systems to create virtual service organizations, to create virtual networking. These are major trends in supply chain. So, bringing it a little back to the subject of buying. What is buying? What do we mean by organizational buying? It's very simple. It's finding out where we use the resources and getting them to the right place at the right time, to the right quality in the right way. That's what it's do. It involves working with others. It involves creating a set of complex network relationships. If you look at buying activity in the big retailers, by which I mean especially the big fashion companies, right. Over the years, they've long understood that procurement, purchasing, buying activities is the #1 business function. If you go and look at the CEOs of the major retail companies, they are the buyers. They are the guys who make the decisions that strategically direct the company into its future. If they buy the wrong fashion item in the wrong color, the company sells zero. They know what they're doing. This is what this is about. When we look at organizational buying as a discipline and we start to break it down into its areas, it starts to break down to procurement and purchasing. So what is this? Procurement. Procurement is about planning the purchase. It's not about making it, it's about planning it. It's about determining standards. It's about developing specifications. It's about researching supplier markets. It's about selecting and appraising for the right suppliers before we ask them to bid. Don't wait to bid and then appraise. Appraise before you ask. You're wasting your time. It's too late once you've asked someone to do it. You're putting a fire out, not stopping it start. It's about value analysis. And remember, value does not mean price. It's about value analysis. It means creating the right level of financing. It means negotiating prices when necessary. It means forming and working with the purchasing team to make the purchase. It means it's about contract administration and administrating contract. Contract management is not about just dealing with big things. Contract management is still contract management if you've just bought a bottle of water. It's managing the contract. The contract is the buy. That's what it means. It's about controlling inventory in stores. It's about making sure you understand about disposable and all the related functions. Procurement activity is the whole corporate overview of the input to output function of any business. It is strategic in nature. It is a strategic business function. It impacts on survival of businesses. That's what it does. And that is procurement, and it's not purchasing. Purchasing is simply the function by which we do it. So if we look in detail at what procurement is, procurement activity is a main strategic function in a business which is integrated into the supply chain function for business success. It is a proactive function. It looks and tries to find out where the problems may come and then tries to find ways to resolve them before they even start. It's the same old story, you know, if you have a headache, what do? Do you take an aspirin or do you stop the headache starting? If you wait for the aspirin, you've got a problem. So, look at another way. Who is the procurement person? The procurement person is the ultimate risk manager. He's the GP. When you're sick, you go to see your general practitioner. Your general practitioner has a broad range of understanding about all of the functions that may affect you medically. He then selects the appropriate specialist for you to go and see. That is procurement. It's a very broad understanding of all elements of business activity. And they then understand who they need to go to get the right different solutions to help them. What is purchasing itself then? It follows the key requirements to actually acquire those goods. It's about accomplishing certain key organizational goals, and it has very serious objectives. It's about maintaining quality and value. It's about minimizing the cash tied up in inventory. It's about maintaining flows through businesses, and it's about helping through its own function to help the organization to strengthen its competitive position. The reality is purchasing itself works as a reactive function to procurement. It reacts to need. So what is purchasing indeed? It may also get itself into development and reviewing the work of the procurement people. Receipts, processing, advertising for bids, evaluation. It's about all of these elements that are very much more clerical, administrative part of what the procurement function actually does. We may think about procurement and purchasing as a set of disciplines. Responsibility, professionalism, effectiveness, efficiency, a set of key disciplines that we need to embed into our activities. And the last slide is a slide that is designed by the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, the world's leading procurement and supply institute, the only academically professional institute of its kind in the world. And this is one that looks at the processes that actually are undertaken. You'll notice from the slide that it takes you through 13 key elements. 13 key elements. Those key elements are a process mapping. All organizations have a procurement cycle. If you have sat, someone would have sat down and designed the procurement cycle. That's what they do. But it goes through the processes. And you will notice that every now and again, throughout the process, at every link, it says GR. GR means before you do something else, stop, think, go back, ask. We could spend hours going through that very model that's in front of you, and I frequently have to do that with students. In fact, probably not hours, even weeks or years, because it's a very complex set of procedures. It's not as simple as it may first look. But it just gives you an idea of what's involved. In simple terms, the external environment, you can see what's going on. This is procurement work. This is what procurement does. It's far more detailed than people believe, and it's incredibly important, as I explained when we started earlier on, about just over 45 minutes ago now, nearly 30 minutes ago, about 30 minutes ago. So as we come to the end of that, I think the thing to do is find out is, does anybody have any questions? Please now type your questions. Right, I'm just waiting to see. Okay, I seem to have one person's actually asked for additional clarification about the difference between purchasing and procurement. I think what we should probably do is send that out as a note, because I think it'd be quite complex and would probably take far too long beyond what I've already told you. So we can send out a simple note and post it. All right, and we'll be putting that on when we post up the details. Okay, just to support this and clarify it. Okay, so unless there's any more questions, I just want to thank you all for attending.